Good evening, everyone. I'm going to call our Contra Costa Transportation Authority meeting for Wednesday, January 20th to order. Thank you all for being here. I know there are lots of other places with probably more scintillating conversation happening in our county, but this is a very important meeting as well, and we appreciate your being here. I would like to ask you all to join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All righty. The first item on our agenda, this is the meeting of the Transportation Authority. Some of you may be here for the expenditure plan meeting, which will follow this meeting immediately after the conclusion, but this is our regular meeting of the Contra Costa Transportation Authority Board. The first item on our agenda is public comment, where members of the public are invited to address the board on any item that is not listed on tonight's agenda. So is there anyone in the audience who wishes to address us on any item not listed on tonight's agenda? Seeing no one come forward, we will close the public comment period and go to the next item, which is the approval of the minutes. I will ask if there's any corrections, additions, or a motion for approval.
Move approval.
Second.
Okay. Motion by Romick, second by Abelson. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries unanimously. Next item is the consent calendar. And there are several items here from the Admin and Projects Committee as well as from the Planning Committee. Anything anyone wishes to pull, or corrections, comments, or a motion?
Move approval. Second.
Motion by Tatson, second by Arnrich. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries unanimously as well. Thank you very much. And now to the main event this evening. We have a speaker. We have a guest. Gary Gallegos from Sandag is here. You remember he was here about a year ago and was able to fill us in on their progress. He's got some updates for us. Good news, which is wonderful. And so welcome, Gary. We're glad to have you here.
Madam Chair.
There you go.
So, Madam Chair, thank you for having me this evening. It's always a pleasure to come back to Contra Costa. And I should start by saying that, I think one of the good things that's happening statewide is agencies across the state, like Sandag and the Contra Costa Transportation Authority, continue to learn and share from each other. I want to highlight Lindsay right behind me because we got turned on to the telephone town hall meetings I think you all have tried to do. We're in a process of doing the same kind of thing, and it's, I think, a new way to be able to reach many folks that sometimes don't either have the time or can't come and give input. So it's a new way for us to get input from the public, so we're excited about being able to also borrow and use ideas that have worked well for you here in Contra Costa. But in terms of tonight, I think what this, we drew the short straw right after SB 375 passed and changed the requirements in terms of how we put plans together. We were the first entity in California to have to develop an RTP with a sustainable community strategy called the SCS. We went through that. Now we're at the Supreme Court litigating the last pieces of that. The crazy thing, and to your point maybe about good news, is that we update these long-range plans every 4 years, which is an area that I would say we should probably question whether we should be doing them that often, but that's what we got to do. That's what we got to do. So we've now adopted a new, an updated RTP with the new SCS. I'm pleased to share with you that at least on this last one, the time frame for challenges from CEQA have elapsed, and in this last RTP we have no CEQA challenges. And I thought what I would do is to highlight the things that we learned from the first time to the second time, the things that we tried to do differently. I brought sort of 4 handouts to share with the commission, if that's okay. And, you know, the first piece I wanted to share, because a lot about SB 375 talks about, you know, better integration between land use and transportation. And I wanted to briefly share a chart that shows at least our experience in San Diego County, where we were able to, we looked back to 1999, and as this chart gets handed out, what you see here is a pictorial of what our growth forecast and working with all our 18 cities and counties within the county of San Diego, what we were forecasting the growth of the region was going to be and where it would grow. And so what you see here is what's in brown is where there are jobs, and what's in tan are where people are going to be housed. And so if you contrast this from 1999 to 2015, in 1999, at the turn of the new century, the plan in San Diego was to preserve about a third of the county for open space. All the new housing that was being planned at the time, most of it, you know, it's almost a split between multifamily housing and single-family housing, and the effect that would have had on our whole, our total housing stock in the region was that we would have ended up with about 61% being single-family house and multifamily housing. And so if we fast forward to at least what was happening in San Diego at the turn of the century to where we're at today, the last forecast, you can see there in 2015, that today we've planned over 55% of the county has been preserved in open space. Our land use authorities, our county and our city have all pretty much updated their general plans. The county took some major actions in downzoning some of the zoning in the backcountry to sort of direct more of the growth into the urban areas. The impact that had on housing in San Diego today, and housing continues to be one of our challenges. I suspect it's a challenge for you guys in terms of affordability and enough housing to supply the economy and the workforce in our regions. But what we see today is about 82% of the houses being built or that are being planned to be built in San Diego County are multifamily houses, and a very small piece are single-family houses. And so, you know, our local governments and really the market has really turned quite a bit from where we were back at the turn of the century. And what that means for us is that, you know, about half of our housing into the future will be multifamily housing, and half of it will be single-family housing. And I think these numbers then help drive what we might do transportation-wise in order to address the mobility needs in the region. And so turning maybe sort of some new things that we did in the plan in order to achieve the goals. I wanted to share a concept that we continue to be bullish on, and it's what we call this mobility hubs. And I think a great opportunity for us that we didn't see even 5 years ago is, you know, what's happening with the whole shared economy and shared mobility. And one of the challenges I think we in the business have always had, particularly on transit, and I mean, I think Contra Costa is a great example that you've got a great transit system like BART, which I just used to get from Oakland to here. But, you know, how do I get, in this case, it's easy that I can sort of walk from the station to the meeting here, but what if that meeting was 3 or 4 miles away? Or, you know, how do I get that last piece of my trip solved? And what I think is a great opportunity for all of us around the country today is what's happening with shared mobility. And, you know, what role is Uber and Lyft and other shared mobility pieces? Are, you know, is that a more cost-effective way and a better service way to provide customers with sort of that last service? But we believe that those are opportunities. You've got all these kinds of mobilities, and so in our plan, we've committed to doing these mobility hubs where we can try to intersect the shared mobility with the traditional, you know, transportation system as we know it today, bike parking, even segways. In San Diego, we continue to have quite a bit of success with Car2Go, reaching neighborhoods, particularly in our downtown urbanized area where families are choosing to maybe only have one car or, you know, maybe have no cars, but the ability to be able to use a car to go to get to where they want to go and back has been a good tool for us in San Diego. We continue to expand our active transportation system. That's another new thing that we did as the plan moved forward. We did a lot of work in the area of health, and this ties into this shared mobility where we did a pretty extensive health impact assessment. And I would share with the commission that it really took us sort of thinking in different ways about how we may do this rather than the traditional ways. And we're continue to be bullish on this idea of mobility hubs and the need to bring all these pieces together in a very dynamic way, particularly as the shared economy grows. And from a demographics perspective, the other thing we like about it is that we think it also helps address two needs, because from a San Diego perspective, and I suspect not that different either nationally or statewide, that our demographic shows that the two fastest growing populations in our region are our senior population and our millennials. And so this shared mobility really offers an opportunity to, first of all, I think, we can give the millennials credit for, they're willing to share more things, and, the idea of, sharing a car or sharing, a house or share, I think, we're seeing a more willingness from that segment of our population. But we continue to look at this as the urban sharing piece is that Lyft and Uber and places like that may also provide our senior population with way more choices than we might have been able to give them hadn't we had this ability to share. The other thing I wanted to highlight is one of the things we did in our plan, and one of the things that was contentious in the lawsuit, and if somebody had told me, you're going to be in front of the Supreme Court defending a long-range regional transportation plan, I'd have thought you were crazy, but the reality is that's where we're at today. And one of the things that we did, and I was sharing with Randy, and it was a little bit of a tough sell sometimes with our staff and our particularly our modeling team, is, how do you try to dream and how do you look at what might be aspirational? And if you look at the executive orders that, both Governor Schwarzenegger and most recently, Governor Brown have issued, they're going to be tough to meet. They're not easy to meet. To reduce greenhouse gas in absolute numbers by 80% of the absolute number in 1990 is a tall hill, a tall mountain to climb. And so one of the things, and I think the challenge with some of our modelers is that they want to work the problem to a solution. And what we did with this chart is what you see in blue there. The blue line is what emissions at about 37,000 tons per day in the San Diego region would have been, looking out into the future. Now the tan line there, or the brown line, those are what we think happens with the emissions when the state passed the PAVLI and the low carbon fuel standards. And so, hopefully what you get out of this is you see that it's through those fuel standards and the PAVLI rules that we're probably going to see, at least in the short run, we believe, the greatest impact in terms of reducing greenhouse gas. But as we looked at land use, and we looked at, and I shared with you all the land uses changes we're making, 82% of all new homes being, multifamily homes, our assessment is that land use still very important, but it's probably not going to be a big game changer in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. And we believe that then technology and probably the replacement of the combustion engine is probably what's likely going to net us the biggest benefit in terms of helping to reduce greenhouse gas. So we worked with our modeling team to not try to work the problem to the answer, but start with the answer and work back. And so what you see here is what our board's been able to use this for is you see if 25% of the vehicles would be zero emission, that's the first yellow curve you see there. And if 50% were zero emission, you see where that curve takes you. And if 75% were zero emission, you see where that takes you. And so you note that at the bottom there, that gray line is what would be required in 2050 to meet, Governor Schwarzenegger's executive order. And so, this chart at least tells us that, look, if it's going to be by replacing the combustion engine, it just can't be one or two. we probably got to have close to 3/4 of the fleet convert to something other than a combustion engine. And in that regard, I think the actions that our board's taken that I think are a little different and out of the box is that we're doing more studies on an alternative fuel system for the San Diego region. We're funding a piece that would allow more charging facilities throughout the region. And I would just share with the commission on a personal note that in my own family that we've converted at least one of our vehicles now is a Leaf that's zero emission that we use, solar rooftop as an example as a way to charge that vehicle. And it really has changed sort of the way a part of my family travels in terms of, the range. But we're seeing, I think, in my opinion, and I want to give kudos to Randy here because I think he's a leader nationally in this arena. I think we're just starting to scratch that technology that as that technology, allows a broader range, as that range gets to 100 or 200 or 300 miles, that could be a significant game changer in trying to achieve some of these curves. And what we as a regional agency are doing are trying to put and work with our local governments to put the infrastructure in place so that when that opportunity comes, we'll be ready to be able to take advantage of that. And that's, one of the things we're doing. So bottom line, as we get to the last chart I'm going to hand out, so what does this mean in terms of the goals that the state gave us? And I'm pleased to share that, we are meeting or exceeding the goals that CARB gave us. What's in this chart here is the two targets that CARB gave us under SB 375 for the San Diego region. Fairly similar to the ones in the Bay Area, but not exactly because they did tailor them to different parts of the state. But we were supposed to reduce our per capita greenhouse gas by 7% by 2020. Our current plan gets us to minus 15%, and our 2035 goal that CARB gave us that was at minus 13%, we get to minus 21%. And so it's a combination of doing things differently, changing some land use assumptions, also changing and phasing what kind of transportation projects we put in. But I would leave the commission with that if we want to do more, and I suspect that this is not unique to San Diego, that it's probably that technological piece, at least what we're finding is that the land use piece, while really important, is probably not going to be the big game changer. I think what the land use piece does is it helps you sustain your gains, but it's not necessarily by itself going to be the big game changer in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from a San Diego perspective. And so, Madam Chair, that's a update of where we're at. I should briefly say in terms of the old plan, one of the crazy things is while we got a new plan, we're still defending the old plan. And as I was having a conversation with some of your staff here and saying, well, isn't it a moot point? And I think it's probably a moot point in the sense that we got a new plan, but what's not a moot point is that in front of the Supreme Court, the big issue is the reach and the effect that the governor's executive order has. And in our first plan, while we acknowledge Governor Schwarzenegger's executive order and the work we did, our board chose not to use that as a significance threshold in terms of CEQA. That the board, we still believe, has discretion in using thresholds that it believes are significant. In the second one, out of an abundance of caution, we did use the executive order, but I also want to emphasize that we did that because the board chose to do that, not because they had to do that. And what we're testing in the Supreme Court, I think, is do you have to versus do you get to choose to do that? And so that piece of the issue that's in front of the Supreme Court is probably still pretty important, not just to San Diego, but probably for anybody that does a CEQA document, and that would mean, many entities, and including private sector folks around the state. And then the last thing I want to just share with you that, I think the good news is, we got a better plan. The good news is that people are more engaged. The bad news is that these things are way more expensive. And so I went back and looked at 2007 when we did an RTP before SB 375 in the San Diego region. It cost us about $2 million to do that RTP, including the EIR. We had about 400 to 500 comments that we had to respond to. By the time we're doing that same EIR in 2011 under the new SB 375 rules, that cost had gone up to $5 million. The comments had gone up from 400 or 500 comments to 4,000 comments. And that's the one we got sued on that we're still defending. The new one, which is, I think, a better document. We've done a lot more work. There's been a lot more public disclosure. So on many, many metrics, it's a way better document than we did the first time. But I'm saddened to say that, this last one cost us $10 million. And we had about 10,000 comments, right, from members of the public and interest groups. And so while the good news is that, better plan, more disclosure, but these things are getting expensive. So at some point, it's probably legitimate to have a conversation of, should we be updating them every 4 years if they're this expensive? Because we've seen our costs almost go up by 5 times, from $2 million to $10 million. And we are not alone in this. I would venture to say that statewide, there's probably a few $100 million that are being spent on some of these updates of the plan. And very often, I would argue, in my experience of having done many of these in the San Diego region, that from 4 years to 4 years, there are subtle changes on the outside, but the bulk of the plans, kind of stay the same. So I thought I should share the cost side of this thing with you. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Gary. Wow, lots of questions. As Amy and I are both members of the MTC doing this plan again, and our second one isn't due until 2017, we appreciate the information you can give us to help us avoid what you went through the first time, and we certainly learned from you as we went through it. But you're right, it's extremely expensive, and it takes a full 4 years to even do a plan. And then as soon as you pass it, you turn around exactly 2 weeks later after everybody's taken a quick vacation and start in again. And maybe
we adopted ours in October, and we gave the staff a little break till January and come back, and they're now working on the next plan, right?
That's about what we did, yeah. And we're pushing our deadline this time because it really does take the full time. So that's going to be tough. I found it really interesting that you were mentioning that you discovered you cannot meet the requirements through housing alone, and in fact, those are not the biggest indicator. It's actually the change of technology that is the bigger impact on the greenhouse gases, and it's certainly what we've been talking about, but it's one of those discussions that's a hard one to have with folks who want to continue sprawl, because there's got to be a meeting of the two. How did you manage that merging of the two concepts of keeping things somewhat compact at the same time?
And on that front, in some ways, I would argue that San Diego had been progressive, and actually the state requirements maybe made it harder on us, because as a practice, we already had, before SB 375, we had a regional comprehensive plan, and the region as a whole had bought into the idea about concentrating new development in the urban piece. But one of the things that's, and I find with interest based on my almost 20 years at Caltrans, the diversity of the state of California, that no two areas are exactly the same. And in the case of San Diego, we have de facto an urban growth boundary that, whether the voters voted it or whether we're not, we can't grow south because we've got an international boundary and a foreign country to the south. We obviously have the Pacific Ocean to the west, and we've got the military Camp Pendleton to the north. That's also a constraint in terms of growth going north. And then east, because of terrain and water availability and other issues in San Diego, the urban part of San Diego that's been growing over the last 20 or 30 years have been in the western third of the county. And so I think we've got an urban boundary that made it natural for our county to get to where we're at. I would share, if we wanted to contrast that with somebody that's probably at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, if we looked at Sacramento County or some of the counties in San Joaquin, where the land's relatively flat, there's a lot of ag land, and you can look out as far as the eye can that you see, and you can figure out whether you convert rice fields to subdivisions. That there's, it's a whole different game. In San Diego, I think our constraints have led us to where we're at, and our cities were already headed there. It's just SB 375 is maybe pushing us to get there a little faster.
Great. Questions for Gary? Tom?
So Sandag encompasses 2 counties, right?
No, just one county, San Diego County only.
Oh, I was looking at the list. I saw Imperial County in there.
No, Imperial County's not ours. Every once in a while there's talk about that, but it's never happened.
Oh, okay. So maybe this isn't a good question to ask you, but in our equivalent regional transportation agency up here has what, 9 counties?
Yes.
And it's getting ready to apparently merge with our regional planning agency. And so we're sitting here in CCTA, which is one of our sub-regional transportation agencies, and it seems to me like at some point that if this merger between transportation and planning happens at the regional level, that organizations like CCTA are going to have to look at broadening themselves into being both planning and transportation agencies. Does that make sense?
Well, I would say from a San Diego perspective, I think one of our advantages is that we've been a one-county MPO. The Bay Area is complicated because of the fact that you got 9 counties and a large urban area. So I would say that that's one of our advantages. But I do think our experience in San Diego, because we went through a similar merger, ours was a little different. We called it a consolidation. We had a state senator that was sort of shaking up the trees, and his frustration was that decision-making was too fragmented. So it was easy for the planners to blame the implementers for not implementing, and it was easy for the people implementing to say, well, I got a really terrible plan, so it was hard to implement. And so we went through this consolidation to where the buck stops with us. So we now have the responsibility of not only doing the plan, but implementing them. And I would argue that in our 15 years of doing that, I think that's a strength for us, because if we've done a poor job, it is our fault that we've done a poor job. But on the other hand, if we've done a good job, it's because we're pulling it all together. And I do think the entities across the spectrum are going to have to sort of broaden their blinders, maybe to your point, and not just silo themselves, because it's planning and housing and urban development, economic development, a lot of things that are coming together to drive our global economies here. And I don't think even on the transportation side we can just silo ourselves.
Thank you.
Noah?
Tom, first of all, thanks for being here. It is exciting that you're kind of one of the first regional agencies to come out and respond to a lot of new legislation. And, on paper, the numbers look really good. But just to go backwards a little bit of what our fellow mayor from Richmond was talking about, you had 2 agencies that kind of merged, but your agency that you really started with on transportation, that was a self-help agency created out of a sales tax measure.
Well, sort of, and that's where it's complicated, because none of us look exactly the same, but we were the MPO. And so in that sense, before our consolidation, as we called it, or our merger started, we were already the equivalent of your MTC and your ABAG here in the Bay Area.
So you were created through legislative action, not a sales tax.
Sort of. So we started out as a joint powers authority. And so as a joint powers authority, it was 18 cities coming together, choosing to be a member.
Like a council of government.
And that's why we were an association of governments. And when the senator started shaking the trees, one of the arguments was under the JPA that in our history we had seen cities choose to not like a decision that didn't go their way and say, look, I'm going to take my ball and go home. And 20 or 30 years ago, in a place like San Diego, where there was lots of space between the cities, it probably didn't make that much different. But if you look at how urbanized we become, unless you really pay attention when you left one city and went to another city, we're one big urban area with people living in one place and working in another place. And so now back when we went through this merger, the consensus was that, it was mandatory that all the cities participate. And it was in that process that we got created in state legislation that required all the cities to be part of. And we wear lots of hats. So we wear the MTC hat, we wear the ABAG hat, we wear the self-help county hat like you guys do as a taxing component here. We do a lot of public safety stuff, and we do a lot of, our portfolio is we wear somewhere on the magnitude of about 18 different hats that we do regionally. But the board all decided, and I would argue that one of our strengths is because we're one county and all 18 cities are at the table, so nobody gets left out. And when I look at either SCAG or MTC, it's more complicated because there's multiple counties and many cities. I mean, I think if you look at SCAG, there's close to 190 cities that make up the SCAG region. So, how do you put 190 cities in a room to try to decide what you want to do? It's difficult, right? And so we've got some inherent advantages, but we've strengthened those legislatively to make sure that everybody's at the table.
So funding-wise then, so do you still have a structure where you have some sales tax, you're the recipient or the clearinghouse for federal dollars, and you have membership fees? How does all your funding, because funding has a lot to do with who you are and how you act.
Well, and from the funding perspective, that's probably been one of our biggest strengths, because we in essence become the financer or the banker, because we get this MTC would here gets all the federal funds that come here. Well, those come to us. All the state funds that comes through the state program come to us, and any local funds that we get through developer impact fees or others on this regional system come to us. And so then we commingle those with the sales tax, and that's what allows an agency like mine, where we have typically our budget may be in the magnitude of anywhere from about $1.2 to $1.5 billion a year. But if you track what made up that over $1 billion of revenue, it's that we're able to pull all the pieces together. And so one of the things, and sometimes that works to our advantage, and sometimes it works to our disadvantage. One of the things, for example, is that we are able to leverage our dollars, I would argue, a little further because it's one body making all those financial decisions. Now, where we get dinged for that is sometimes the advocacy groups, for example, say, if you guys were just like MTC, things would be better. Well,
Don't count on that.
well, and so, look, everything has its reason for, people have reasons for why they say what they say. But in that regard, I think what they're saying is, and I think MTC's done some pretty cool things where they've managed to take money sort of off the top and figure out what they're going to do on some of these incentive programs. And then whatever's left, they figure out how they split it up with all the 9 counties in terms of what you do. Well, if you're an interest group that wants that special thing done, that's probably easier to do at FTC than it is at Sandag, because we've already leveraged that money. We can't spend it twice, right? Our board's already gone through and said, we're going to match this dollar with that dollar to do this project. And at any one time in our programming documents, we'll have, several hundred projects, and color of money matters. And our experience is that every one of our projects has not one source of funding, but 3 or 4 sources of funding. And within those sources, they're different. So, a certain kind of federal dollar might be, have different requirements on it. And we get to commingle all that. And so from that perspective, we get an advantage in terms of leveraging. But we do get dinged because sometimes we're not as progressive because we've already spent the money.
And last question, what percentage of that annual revenue comes from your sales tax?
So today our sales tax in San Diego County is generating about almost $300 million. So out of $1 billion, let's say a third to a quarter comes from the sales tax measure. Some of those will be bonded because we're out in the market, we're bonding dollars. So there's times that budget will grow because we're borrowing dollars to leverage dollars, but I'd say roughly about a third.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, and thanks for coming here today.
Thank you for having me.
Ron and then Chris?
Yeah, thank you for the report. I just wanted to share a comment. Certainly the city of Concord does not have the money that you're talking about and the size of San Diego. But I did want to say that we have a vision that we've been working on with our Concord Downtown Specific Committee, where we're trying to incorporate a lot more higher density homes near BART downtown. And also, we have a Concord Naval Weapons Station that's going to be redeveloped, and we're talking about, again, having not only higher density, but the way you guys have preserved some of the land, we're preserving 67% of that to open space. In addition to that, we're in a plan right now where we're trying to develop a citywide bike and pedestrian plan to make our city more walkable and bikeable. So we're working on that as well. So we're doing our share. We also have a Coast Guard property that is adjacent to the Naval Weapons Station and BART, the North Concord BART. And so we're trying to do that as well by putting higher density housing there as well. So we have the same type of vision. Our problem, of course, is we don't have the same type of money for transportation, and I think that that's what all of us would like to have.
And I think, Commissioner, I think the key to, I don't think none of us are going to have enough money, because even though the numbers I spoke to are larger than yours, but relative to size, we probably struggle the same way, that we don't have enough. And as I've learned from my good friend Randy Wasaki, who's probably one of the best guys at doing this, and that's leveraging funds. And so none of us are going to have all the dollars that we need. And I do think that the secret to success moving forward is, how do we leverage this dollar with that dollar to hopefully complete a broader vision that a community or a region may have. And, in that regard, we're now in the process, just like you guys are, in terms of considering going back to our voters. On the open space, one of the things that we're working on is that if you're going to preserve property in open space, then you also have to have the dollars to make sure that that property can be managed, that it can be monitored, that it can be maintained. So it's not as easy as putting up a sign and not worried about it. But I would tell you that one of the areas that with our citizens seems to be resonating is in the world of climate change, whether you believe in it or you don't, or whether who caused it. But I know from a Southern California perspective, and in San Diego, we're starting to see more wildfires. And we've seen that, we've had, yours truly here has been evacuated at least once because of a wildfire. And so we're now talking and back to leveraging and connecting things. So there's some road improvements, as an example, that now we're working with the community to figure out how we do those as fire evacuation routes. Because in the last fire, it was hard to evacuate out of some of those areas because there just wasn't enough capacity. And so, so it's not just about a road, but it's also about how we might use that in time of crisis to evacuate people out of that part of our region. We're looking at, how do we preserve the open space in a way that we manage it with an eye on fire protection, so that, there may be some need for, controlled burns. There may be some need for thinning out of certain parts of the open space in a way that hopefully helps protect San Diego to live in a changing world. Because having wildfires that shut down our economy for months and wipe out hundreds of homes is not the secret to having a sustainable economy in a place like San Diego. And so those kinds of things at least are starting to resonate with some of our residents, that maybe there's another way to do this stuff.
Yeah. Well, we're fortunate that we don't have a lot of trees in that area, so we're not too concerned about that. And one of the things that we're doing is we have an arrangement with the state parks. We're going to be turning over a lot of the land to the state parks and let them maintain it.
And I would just encourage you that, you have some level of service maintenance agreement with the state, because just because you give it to somebody else doesn't mean they'll do a good job with it, right?
Exactly right. And we're very aware of that, but thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, Chris.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. In this technology versus planning issue, my read of the trial court opinion and the Court of Appeals opinion is that you, and I mean you generically, you, MTC, all these folks, have a responsibility to tease out the relative contributions of the various state agencies that are imposing the technological changes, and to reduce not just GHGs, but to reduce VMT. And to do that, you need to do the planning piece, which it looks like you're doing in your new plan. Is that the way you read it as well?
I don't necessarily read it that way. I mean, and that's been a legitimate debate since SB 375 got signed. I actually they created, CARB created an advisory committee, and there was a big debate. Is the law about GHG reduction, or is it about VMT reduction? And I am of the school that, reducing VMT is one way to reduce greenhouse gases, but it's not the only way to reduce greenhouse gases. And when we look at our history and in our case, I think one of the challenges that our board, and I suspect boards like you have, is that you got to balance lots of things. It's not just one thing. And so I argue that if it's truly about greenhouse gas reduction, there are many ways, including VMT, and not to downplay that reducing VMT may not be important, but there may be more cost effective, there may be better ways. And our analysis shows that if we really want to turn the dial, that, forcing people, out of their cars if we don't have a way better system and a lot of density to, because transit's pretty expensive to make work. And we're, in our region, we have a fare box recovery of about 40%.
Pretty good.
Which is probably better than most places in the country, but that means that for every dollar of service we put out there, we're going to get 40% of it from the fares, and so we got to subsidize the other 60%. And transit operations continues to be a challenge for us in terms of how we do that. And so while I don't discount the importance of VMT, I would share that I think that's been an argument. Whether is it all about VMT or is it about greenhouse gases?
It's about both. The second question is maybe a more technical legal one. I've followed all the briefing in the Supreme Court, and it's an important and a fascinating legal issue. But with the new legislation that sets the 2050 goals in statute, not just in executive order, as a practical matter, isn't the case in the Supreme Court now largely theoretical?
If they get to where they've set the goals, and that was has been one of our arguments all along, that if it becomes the law of the land, well then we follow that law of the land, but that law of the land is set by the legislature and the governor going through a process where the legislature writes the law, the governor signs it. The governor, if he doesn't or she doesn't sign it, they veto it. Legislature can override it. If they do, it becomes law. Versus our argument's been about executive orders, and that still continues to be an argument because there are a lot of executive orders that the governor's history has signed, and if they all become to where they have the force of law, well, I would argue maybe we don't need a legislature.
De Leon's legislation pretty much puts the 2050 goals in legislation that's been signed by the governor.
Yeah, and so we think that once that happens, and they set those goals, then those become the goals, and they're the law of the land, and not only we, but everybody else should follow.
Yeah.
Thank you. Don?
Thank you, and thanks for coming. It looks like you've made a lot of progress. I was looking at your first chart, which is the 1999 and 2015 plan, and I see that there's been a big increase in the area that's planned for preservation. I have two questions. One is, what kind of programs are you putting in place to ensure that land is preserved? And then second, what happens to the light green land?
What happens to the light?
It isn't shown for either multiple
It's
for
sort of
single-family
whitish.
home. It's sort of the whitish area.
Yeah, so those are areas that are still that aren't in the preserve yet, that are still in private ownership. But they got more restrictions because the county has made it harder to develop those, they've downzoned the zoning in the backcountry. And what you see in green represents the 55% that's been preserved. And those have been dedications where they're either run by public agencies or they're run by nonprofits. And that's the piece now that we're going back to try to put a funding source in place to make sure that we have a sustainable revenue source to now manage and operate what you see in the green piece there.
Thank you.
That's great. Gary, thank you so much. This is enlightening. Oh, Amy, did you?
Thank you. Just a quick question, Julie. Thank you. And I'm following up on Dawn's. You know, we're going through the process right now of putting together our transportation measure. The combination of growth management and transportation investment has been a long-standing tradition in Contra Costa County. So one of the things we've been hearing great things about the advanced mitigation program that you put in place. And I know you talked a little bit about the reserves and preserves, and I just wondered if you could share for us how you feel that that's been successful and how it can really enhance a transportation measure, given I think there's a lot of similarity between San Diego and Contra Costa County in terms of growth patterns and historic evolution. And by the way, congratulations on having your incredible success. I think over the years we've all been able to enjoy going to San Diego for various League California cities and focus conferences, and that wonderful news about the joint airport that solved some of the congestion problems with dealing with two countries. You know, we talk about, sometimes we say the Bay Area is like dealing with multiple countries, but you truly are dealing with an international economy and environment, and congratulations on that.
Thank you. And to your, look, I think our, what we call our environmental mitigation program, our EMP program, is an unqualified success. We set aside $875 million in the last measure to be able to mitigate for all the transportation projects. And, you know, very often it's probably just as good or better to be lucky as be good. And so if there was an upside to the downturn and the recession, and, you know, so the downturn and the recession, and we tell folks that, look, on our capital side, we actually saw a windfall, because before the recession, we had revenues that were growing at about 6% per year, but costs were going up at 7 or 8%. And so, you know, that model was not a sustainable model. And, you know, right after the recession, we lost 20% of our revenue. And we did probably a little different than most. You know, most people hit the brakes is probably the good thing to do. We have a pretty strong economic team that worked with our board, and we had convinced ourselves that we should hit the accelerator. And the reason we thought we should hit the accelerator is, you know, we thought that interest rates would fall as they have, and the prices would fall, that we could not sustain the prices. So, you know, we saw our contract bids, instead of being over the engineer's estimate, they were 30%, 40% under the engineer's estimate. I'll take that deal every day. I'll give up 20% of my money for, you know, a 30 or 40% reduction in cost. But what it meant for our open space too is that we were able to take advantage of very historically low interest rates. So we were able to borrow money, and we were able to take advantage of a really tough recession where there were many, many more willing sellers that needed cash for a host of reasons, that were willing to sell land that otherwise might have been very difficult to acquire. And so we were sort of at the right place at the right time with the resources we needed. And we were able to buy about 4,000 acres, to put it in context, in San Diego. And we are buying that property at about 50 cents on the dollar from what we had forecasted we were going to buy it when we put the estimates together in 2002. And so the beneficiary of that is our preserve system, because the way our measure was set up and sort of the deal we made with the environmental community that supported it was that the $870 or $850 million was a set fee. So we couldn't, you know, get it cheaper and then use the money for something else. So we're still using those dollars to take advantage of really good deals. And what that's had on the positive side of the transportation side is, instead of, you know, I had a light rail line, for example, a $2 billion light rail line that in the last probably 2 weeks before I was set to get a record of decision, we had a rainstorm, and they found a fairy shrimp on what arguably was probably a rut that probably, maintenance didn't do a good enough job of making sure. So now I got to deal with a fairy shrimp. And in a normal environment, that would have been a minimum of a year delay. By the time I worked with the resource agencies about where the adequate mitigation is, how much is it, where is it at. But because we've got this big preserve where I've over mitigated and I've got plenty of wetlands with fairy shrimp that are already, thriving, it was a 2 or 3 month delay. Wow. And so there's a tangible example of, $2 billion project that I'm going to be able to move probably months, if not years sooner, because we had this program in place.
So what you're saying also in your example is that the resource agencies are completely on board with you also in terms of acknowledging that this is applicable mitigation for all the projects.
Yeah, and we've got those agreements ahead of time with the resource agencies so that those credits are available, and and really the key in that world, I think, is certainty. And not only certainty for the guy that's mitigating, but also for the regulatory side of the house. And we've got agreements that give us certainty. And I think the proof's in the pudding. It's working.
Great, thank you. Randy, did you have anything else? Okay, very good. Thank you, Gary. We
Thank you for having
really
me.
appreciate it. This is fabulous.
Yeah, and good luck with your measure. We might be there with you, so we'll be cheering each other on. See how it
Well,
goes.
there's enough of us around the state, we might be taking out statewide ads. Who knows?
Right.
Thank you very, very much. Okay, the next item on our agenda is one that I asked to have put on because we are doing, as you all know, the next meeting tonight will be our transportation expenditure plan. And rather than have me chair both of them, because we will be changing chairs next month, it makes more sense to me to ask one of our longtime members, Don Tatson, to assume the role of chair of our Transportation Expenditure Plan Committee. And so I asked for this to be an action item on this agenda, and I would ask all of you to join me in appointing Don to do that for us over the next 6-month period as we get to the point where we need to get our expenditure plan on the ballot. I think he will do an excellent job. He is a wonderful facilitator and will be taking on that role tonight. I will be here to help with that. We are going to be a tag team if you will approve this measure, but that I would take the chair's prerogative of nominating Don to do that over the next 6 months. And I've got a second over here from Newell, and I've got for discussion, Dave?
I was going to move Don Tatson, but that's okay.
It's done. All right. That takes some of the load off your shoulders for the next 6 months as you take over and be chair. So all in favor of that motion, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstain? That carries unanimously. Thank you all very much for that. And under that same item, you all note the schedule for the special meetings. We have correspondence and communications in your packet. We have committee reports in your packet. I have no other chair's comments or reports. Commissioner comments, reports on any special activities. Anybody need to report out? Seeing nobody, we will. Chris.
Yeah, I spent last week at Transportation Research Board in Washington, D.C. I was only able to attend one of Randy's 3 presentations. I would like to report, as you well know, his presentation was brilliant, and he is highly respected by his colleagues all around the country.
Yes, I understand it was more than a packed house. It was not only standing room only, but barely room to breathe. So that's wonderful, and we are very proud. Executive staff comments, Randy?
Commissioners, it really wasn't that. There was 4 other speakers, so it wasn't just me.
But I appreciate everybody staying around to hear my executive director's report. And usually you're all gone by this time, so thanks a lot for indulging me. Normally in the month of December, staff is taking time off and we're enjoying the holiday season with our families. And it just seems like this year everything has gone haywire and the workload has gone up. And so we're diligently trying to manage people's times off so that they can spend that necessary time with their families and their loved ones, but also get the program out and then make sure that we do all the things we need to do to keep this potential measure moving. So I wanted to once again thank the team for all the work that they've done over the holidays, because I know that's normally a time when we clean out the desks and grind up all the paper and do all those kinds of things. We've been getting a lot of different delegations. We had delegation from China, a delegation from the Netherlands to come see us to talk about technology deployment and what we're doing. And so we asked them a question, how'd you find us? And what they said was the internet. And so apparently we're first on the internet. So Lindsay, you've done a great job. When somebody Googles innovation, they probably get Sandag first and then CCTA second, because Sandag's bigger than we are. The National Freight Advisory Committee met a couple times over the phone. We've developed a letter to the Secretary on the comments of the draft, the first strategic freight plan for the United States. And so our comments are headed there during the TRB meeting, which I attended with Lindsay and Ross. I signed the letter with Mort Downey, who was the Deputy Secretary for U.S. DOT for 8 years. The guy has forgotten more about transportation than I'll never, ever know. The guy is a genius. We did meet with I met with a little cell phone company, and I can say this because we didn't sign an NDA this time. I didn't have to sign any NDA, but I went down to visit with Apple. What they're looking for is an innovative partner to try to do a smart map. So the idea is to develop a map of the future where it's embedded in the vehicle, and you'll have speed zones, you'll have signal phases, you'll have all these different bits of information. So these autonomous vehicles, you're not going to need signs in the future, and all this information will be right there. So hopefully in the future we'll be able to convert some of that roadside into some parks and other things for people to ride their bicycles. Diablo Magazine you'll see an article here one of these days in print about the Interstate 680 and the Tri-Valley congestion. The question was, why is it going up? And congestion is always a good barometer of the economy. More people are working, and so 680 is getting more congested. So is the 580 corridor. The good news is we had a plan. So we shared our plan, the 680 corridor plan, with them, and talked a little bit about our express lane network, our HOV lane projects, and others. And so I think they were very satisfied with that information. And with that, that's my report, so thank you very much. And thank you, Gary, for coming all the way down from San Diego. We really appreciate that.
Thank you, Randy. I appreciate Gary's being here as well. What he didn't mention, but I will tell you, is he took a bit of a side trip and sat and talked with our consultant for the ABAG-MTC merger a little bit about how San Diego did theirs and how that works for them. So he's giving us information all the way around today, and that's really wonderful. So with that, your calendar, updated calendar, is in your packet. And if there's nothing else for the good of the order, we will adjourn to immediately reconvene as the Transportation Expenditure Plan Committee, and we'll hand the gavel over to Don. Thank you.